am happy to introduce our second keynote speaker, Dr. Stephan Herzog. So Stephan Herzog is a professor of the practice and co-editor of the Non-Proliferation Review at the James Madison Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. So he is my wonderful colleague, and he co-chaired the Beyond Nuclear Deterrence Working Group, a MacArthur Foundation and Harvard project on managing the Atom Initiative. He regularly publishes in academic journals and appears in the media and has written for outlets such as the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the Financial Times, Science, and Washington Post. Dr. Herzog holds a PhD in political science from Yale University and has worked and traveled in over 100 countries. His speech title is Growing Nuclear Risks, Demanding Fresh Perspectives. So now, Stephan, stage is yours.
It's coming back. So I'm going to offer, I think, probably a little bit of a different perspective, and that is that, so next year I will turn 40 and I am a professor, so I have, I'm in a little bit of a different place. But one of the things that I would say is that I was very impressed yesterday when I showed up at the pizza party and saw the nuclear jeopardy that was happening and was able to see and hear, some of the knowledge that was demonstrated on nuclear issues. And thank you very much. And one of the things about it is when I was in high school, as has been mentioned before, there was nothing of this nature that was offered at all. So you could just sign me up immediately, were this to be the case. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity, and I'm very inspired to see you all here in Monterey. Now, I asked ChatGPT to give me images about beyond nuclear deterrence and what that means. And what's interesting is you can see when you look at this that there are multiple different perspectives on what beyond nuclear deterrence is. One side sees peaceful energy, it sees peace signs, we see that the world is a better place. And then the other side sees, well, we have the doves and we have the peace sign, but we have conventionally armed missiles and tanks, because there are people in the world who believe that if you were to eliminate nuclear weapons, the consequence of that would be massive war. And so this is really a dilemma that we face between deterrence and disarmament, and which way things will go in the future and positions on that. This right here is the Groton, New London Naval Nuclear Submarine Base in the United States. And so this is where I was born. My father was a weapons officer on U.S. ballistic missile submarines during the Cold War, and would go out for months at a time to do these types of deterrent patrols. So exactly some of the nuclear targeting that we talked about before was happening in the context of my family. And so this is what I grew up with, and I was always surrounded by books and novels and movies, right? I was born in the 80s. And what's interesting about this at this time is if you look at this chart from the Federation of American Scientists, it will tell you what global nuclear stockpiles looked like. And in the 80s, we reached a peak of over 70,000 nuclear weapons. And as Clifton just said in the last talk, many of these nuclear weapons were far more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, sometimes tens of times or hundreds of times more powerful. Now, those numbers came down after the Cold War ended. They came down monumentally, as you can see. However, we still have a massive number of nuclear weapons in the world, over 12,000 of them, enough to cause considerable damage and human consequences. The world that my parents grew up in and that elder generations, many of them grew up in, was a different world. It was a world filled with things like duck and cover drills. And here in the United States, you see this cartoon, it's very famous, Bert the Turtle giving students instructions on how to duck and cover and to protect themselves in these constant nuclear drills. The reality is that ducking under a desk, putting a paper bag over your head, these sorts of things are not going to do anything if there's a nuclear detonation. Essentially, what these things serve to do is to convince publics that nuclear war is winnable and to justify large levels of investment and defense spending in a world in which, with intercontinental ballistic missiles, major cities can be destroyed in a matter of half an hour. Now, for me, after the Cold War, after this, in the 90s, my father got out of the business dealing with nuclear weapons. Didn't seem to be much of a need for a deterrent mission. The 90s were a time where nuclear arsenals on some level were being reduced. But the discussion of nuclear weapons kind of went away in the 90s, but the weapons didn't. We still have over 10,000 of them today. And for me, not even thinking about the family that I grew up in, this all became very serious after the attacks in the United States of September 11th, 2001, where President George W. Bush is on television and is warning of an axis of evil, is warning of nuclear proliferation by new states, and is warning about the potential acquisition of nuclear weapons by terrorist organizations. So for me at this point, as a teenager, this is when this first became significant and started to click. And I was able to dig up kind of how I looked back then. And it was a different world for me. And I eventually wasn't going to go to college and was, in a touring punk rock band. This is before I had pink hair and a dozen facial piercings. And this is what I looked, and I wasn't thinking about these issues whatsoever. But something clicked about these issues, about the background that I had, and about how I grew up. And that, has wound up taking me from working for a think tank to working for the US Department of Energy, doing nuclear verification activities on treaties, to becoming a professor, to giving talks at the United Nations, because that was the moment, September 11th, and everything that followed after, that I think really got to me. Now, I think we're at a new moment now for your generation, which is not the September 11th moment. And that is currently right now, we've got 9 countries that have approximately 12,300 nuclear weapons, including 9,600 of them that are set for operational use in a conflict. So if you think about the weapons used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we've got about 10,000 of them, most of which are more powerful, that are ready to go, unfortunately. And in today's nuclear world, that didn't really generate well. Those were supposed to be actual bullet points, but this is life. We have, as mentioned, thousands of cities that are merely 30 minutes away from destruction. Those weapons could have been launched at the beginning of this talk, and these cities could be destroyed right now. And this is the world we live in. And for all the talk about missile defense and defending populations, it's very expensive, and it's not really technically feasible. So in the world of nuclear deterrence that we seem to have opted into, this is kind of where we're at. And this is the world that you face, which is why I think it's an important moment. And so here we are. This is from Russian state television, showing essentially images that from the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, that London and Berlin and Paris could be destroyed in a matter of minutes were nuclear weapons to be launched from there in a potential conflict in Europe. This is in the context of the war in Ukraine. I was living in Switzerland when it started, and I did a lot of explainers to the public about, will the shelters in Switzerland work? How do you get potassium iodide pills to defend your thyroid against radiation? Literally explaining to members of the public who have forgotten about nuclear weapons because the period had changed, what the consequences are. And here we are again, that the New START treaty between the United States and Russia is suspended and will expire next year, and it's the sole arms control treaty governing the largest 2 nuclear arsenals. We now have a situation where there may be doubts about whether the United States is willing to defend some of its allies. So we have Poland now talking about in Europe, something which would have been unthinkable 5, 10, 20 years ago, thinking about potentially developing nuclear weapons. We see that a majority of the population in South Korea thinks that it's maybe useful to develop their own nuclear weapons. We are at a moment where I think it's really important to focus on these issues. But I want to say that it's not all gloom and doom. So 186 states have joined the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states, have forsworn legally nuclear weapons. 114 states, I remember from Nuclear Jeopardy yesterday, the Tlatelolco Treaty, right? Latin America and the Caribbean, nuclear weapons free zone. 114 states are members of nuclear weapons free zones. 73 states have joined the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So many states, dozens of them, have triply forsworn nuclear weapons. They've decided that these weapons don't provide for their security and that they're dangerous and maybe they need to do something about them. Now, nuclear deterrence theory, this thing that we talk about, why countries rely on nuclear weapons, was largely conceived in the mid-1940s up until the late 1960s. It is a relic of the bipolar era between the United States and the Soviet Union. And there's a question today, since the literature hasn't evolved that much. Do we think North Korea, China, Israel necessarily think about nuclear weapons in the same way that American and Soviet theorists thought about them? We have participants here this year from India and Pakistan. Is the way people are thinking about nuclear weapons in India and Pakistan the same? Maybe it's not. And we also have new technologies, more destructive bombs, more accurate weapons, fears that artificial intelligence will eventually be put into the nuclear pipeline. So I think nuclear deterrence is becoming more and more risky. Now, let's take this out of context for a second. You all have friends, family, who we know do dumb things. They might not wear a seatbelt in the car. They might smoke cigarettes. You may know people who are involved in gambling. These things all seem like really small risk, right? Like if you start gambling a little bit, you're probably not going to lose your house or your car. You smoke one cigarette, you're probably not going to get cancer tomorrow. You don't wear a seatbelt in the car, it's unlikely that that time you're going to crash the car and you're going to die. But these are all risk, and these things are all possible. And the point about deterrence is even if it may largely be safe on some level, if we believe it, what we've done is we've taken large weapons, pointed them at cities, and then said that we're all safer as a result of creating this vulnerability of pointing them at cities. And there may be a little bit of luck involved in this. All these small risks over time accumulate. So the difference between something which is 97% safe, 99% safe, 99.9, and 99.999% safe is huge. And we don't realize it until we repeat things over and over again. And with nuclear deterrence and all these little actions between states, every day we're actually repeating some of these things over and over again. Take the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. No nuclear weapons use. What if we simulated that 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, 100,000 times? Do you think we get out of those situations without nuclear weapons being used every time? I think it's a little bit dubious, so there may be an element of luck which is involved here. And we know that there are risks of nuclear weapons. The video that we saw yesterday, the close call video with Nuclear Jeopardy, we know that nuclear weapons have been accidentally transported around the United States and to Europe and to other countries. We know about the consequences in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the human consequences that we know about. We know about the downwind radiation consequences of more than 2,000 nuclear explosive tests. And we know about the consequences that the nuclear fuel cycle, which has been used to produce the bomb, creates most of the time on indigenous lands and territories. These are all risks which exist. But I want to say, as I start to wrap up here, there is some cause for optimism. This is a study that colleagues and I from George Mason University in DC and the London School of Economics did, and we surveyed publics in 24 countries about their support for nuclear deterrence, nuclear disarmament, and other things. And we find that around the world, whether it's in Brazil, China, Saudi Arabia, Poland, even the United States, Turkey, Germany, these are countries where publics around the world actually are supportive of nuclear disarmament. And this is what they want in principle, and it's really, really widespread. But there's something complicated about this. We also asked people, do you support nuclear proliferation? And we found, if you look at the blue, that in some of these same countries, the same people who want nuclear disarmament also say that they may want their country to develop nuclear weapons. How do we make sense of this? How can people want to develop nuclear weapons that they want to get rid of at the same time? And the point is this. Psychologically, what I would say is we all care about nuclear weapons, and I think that we are all probably somewhere within the realm of similar views on them. For members of the public at large, nuclear deterrence and nuclear disarmament are not ends. They're means to get somewhere. They're means to provide security, to protect your country, to put food on the table, to protect your family. And the point is people are actually adaptable. So when you see someone who supports nuclear deterrence, it's up to you to get in there, talk to them, and have a conversation with them, because they may be more adaptable than you think. They may not just be, people often like to call them murderers, just as people who support nuclear deterrence often like to call people who support disarmament hippies and things like that. I think there's a psychological division, and it's important to know that these, again, are means rather than ends. So don't always judge people. You need to be, I believe, persuasive. Now, there's space because of this to discuss both deterrence and disarmament. As Masako said, I am the co-chair of the Harvard University and MacArthur Foundation Beyond Nuclear Deterrence Working Group. And this is our group in Hiroshima having a conference where we have people from more than 20 countries, scholars, get together and think about this world beyond nuclear deterrence. What will it look like? How do we get there? Will it actually be dangerous? And we're out there interrogating it. And we think that there's room and intellectual space for this. But more importantly, the field needs you, as my last slide. And that is, we talked about these various moments. My family in the 80s, in the Cold War, our previous speaker's grandfather, this era, me, September 11th. And I think that things now, with the nuclear threats we face in the world, with the intersection of nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence, climate change, and all of these things, I think there's a lot of room and space for you to make contributions. Whether you wind up being a teacher, a professor, a researcher, an activist, working for your government or an international organization, maybe you're just here as an interested student and you won't wind up pursuing something related to nuclear weapons as a career. And that's okay. What we're interested in is you becoming an informed citizen and contributing to these debates and discussions. Whether that is championing disarmament and nonproliferation, or if you turns out to be an advocate of nuclear deterrence, that's okay. But think about ways to reduce nuclear risk, to make things safer, and to have a safer world. And I think there's a lot of space for you in here now. And again, the point that I want to make is I think we're at a really pivotal moment, and I'm really thrilled that you're all here. Thanks.
Thank you to our speakers, and we will now have a Q&A session. When selected, please share your name, school, pronouns, and question.
Please stand in there. Hi, Stephan. He is not here.
Okay. All right.
So if you can use this mic.
All right. Then it will be a question for me.
Hi, Stephan. First of all, my name is Sagar. I am from Seeds of Peace. I came from Mumbai, India. So thank you for such a wonderful presentation, especially the last point that you mentioned about not judging and having a dialogue even with the person who believes in deterrence. I just have a small question of your previous slide. You said that even the missile systems, the missile defense systems cannot stop the nuclear weapons. I'm just curious, like how does that work?
Okay. Is this working? Can we all hear me? So the thing about missile defense is that I think around the world, missile defense has become almost an artifact of faith. And this is particularly true in democracies, because if you think about it, in many autocratic countries, it's okay for leaders to engage in nuclear deterrence and put their populations at risk. In many democracies, the idea that you could have a population at risk with nuclear deterrence that you would not defend is essentially anathema. Missile defense is really complicated as far as physics. It works on some limited level. And I think what oftentimes happens is people see the Israeli success in using Iron Dome and think that that is analogous to ballistic missile defense. And there's a huge difference in the physics between primitive rockets coming from Hamas and ballistic missiles going into outer space and coming back down. These ballistic missile defense is much more expensive than nuclear weapons themselves. And most ballistic missile defense systems have not been tested against countermeasures. If you're capable of putting a rocket into space, you're also capable of releasing decoys, chaff, other things to confuse sensors. So it's really complicated. And I'll just provide you with a story. I had a colleague in a country in Europe who was going on a major media network. And before they went on the media network, when you do these interviews, you often go and you get some pre-questions from someone who's setting you up so they know what the host will ask. And the pre-questions asked my colleague, you know, what about missile defense? Will it work? And my colleague said, well, missile defense won't work. And the thing which is working is nuclear deterrence and vulnerability. And that's kind of what exists. And we all have some level of risk. And the pre-questioner said back to him, well, this can't be true. What about missile defense? You need to tell people on TV that missile defense works. And he says, no, it doesn't work. And she tries again, a third time. And eventually he says, essentially, let's get real. This doesn't work. And we can't intercept Russian weapons which are coming because the physics aren't there. The numbers aren't there. It doesn't work. And the person doing the pre-question started crying. And she said, you can't go on TV and tell the public that we're not safe and you can't be defended. And he ultimately did not get to do the interview. So the point that I'm making is when someone tells you that missile defense works and it will definitely intercept things, it's a good way to sleep at night. But the reality is we are dependent upon nuclear deterrence in order to keep people safe. And the point that I want to make is even if nuclear deterrence has worked before, even if it has kept people safe, there's a high probability of luck involved. And things are happening every day that are complicating that equation and maybe making it more dangerous.
Hello, my name is Fatma, and I'm from Lahore Grammar School Defense with Seeds of Peace from Lahore, Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, my question is that in the beginning, you showed us the AI pictures, right? In a world which is free from nuclear weapons. So I'm a huge fan of Thomas More's Utopia and the idea of an ideal world. So what do you think? Do you think just disarming from nuclear weapons would lead us to that ideal world of utopia? Or are there other objectives with that have to be culminated together?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So I think it's a great question. And one of the things I do a lot is I am a scholar. And so I have my Beyond Nuclear Deterrence working group where I interact with top scholars around the world. And we ask them to think about desirability and getting towards disarmament and then feasibility. And one thing that we see in that working group is that there are massive disagreements over how the world without nuclear weapons would look. And even if you talk to activists from the Nobel Peace Prize winning International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, there's quite a bit of disagreement over them, over how that world could look. Some people believe that if we get rid of nuclear weapons, that we will have something utopic and we will have something resembling peace. I would say that that might mean that we might have to resolve a ton of geopolitical disputes to get there. Others believe that the way to get rid of nuclear weapons is to just have conventional weapons that are more precise and more powerful. And so there's a lot of disagreement. And so there's a question here about which world is more risky or not. And proponents of nuclear deterrence will tell you that having all these weapons pointed at cities is what's keeping us safe. And obviously the point that I'm making to you is I think that it's really risky and we've created vulnerability. But there's something else about this too, which I think is really important. A proponent of nuclear deterrence will frequently tell you that countries are safe because they're pointing weapons at each other and they don't have war between them. What happened during the Cold War? There were dozens of so-called proxy wars between countries. Essentially, some of the casualties in the conflicts were just outsourced to the developing world that we call the third world then, which is now the global south, to people who might not have spoken the same language or looked the same as those who had nuclear weapons, which is a little bit, pessimistic. So I'm not convinced that nuclear weapons are even saving lives or preventing conflicts. They may prevent some, but I don't think they prevent all. And what I would tell you, just to kind of circle around, is I think if we get to a world without nuclear weapons, which I hope we will, I think that it's technically feasible, but I think the desirability side of the equation with countries relying on nuclear weapons for security is the difficult thing. The question is what will that world look like? And I think it's important for us, those people who are researchers and activists who do the analysis, and to push in that direction and to essentially try and, I would say, help to realize the world that you want to realize without nuclear weapons. Thanks. We have a question online, apparently. Can I access it here? I am Kenta from UWC Red Cross Nordic. Thank you for your service. I believe it cannot be stopped in this current. Do you think it is the most important thing to earn higher recognition? Is this? If not, what factor do you think is most crucial all over the world? All right, this is an important question. And what I think that this question will point at and will tell us is, what is the importance of the so-called nuclear taboo? And, you've probably all heard about this on some level, that, nuclear weapons have not been used since 1945 because of the devastating consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. There are a lot of fears right now that the nuclear taboo is being eroded because of the development of more accurate weapons, because of threats that we see from the Russian Federation during the war in Ukraine and risks going back and forth. I personally would like to believe that the risk of nuclear weapons use, while elevated, still remains low. I think it's higher than it was before February 2022, but I think it's unacceptably high. And I am greatly concerned about the potential use of a, quote, low-yield nuclear weapon, either in Ukraine or in a demonstration shot over the Black Sea or over a forest as part of that conflict. And my fear is this: the nuclear taboo as we have it today depends upon the idea of how horrific nuclear weapons are. If, whether it was Russia or another country, would use a smaller nuclear weapon and the consequences were not as devastating, my fear is that that in itself would erode the nuclear taboo and would make nuclear weapons seem more usable, and down the road would lead to countries considering the use of larger nuclear weapons. So what I would say is when we think about the presentations we've had today, I think the real point is I think that it's absolutely vital to engage with the stories of the Habakusha and the survivors and the humanitarian consequences, and to get those out, and to continuously strengthen the nuclear taboo, particularly to carry on those stories and those graphic imagery. Thanks. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you to our esteemed keynote speakers. We appreciate your valuable insights. We will now move on to a break, and please be back in the auditorium by 10:30.